Hi, this is Barb Tanner Wallace. I apparently did the intro right. As you guessed, Donna is not here. She's on vacation. But we are here with our featured author, which is New York Times and USA Today bestseller, Kelly Rimmer, who wrote, wrote two of her books now. She's written The Warsaw Orphan, Things We Cannot Say, The German Wife, The Secret Daughter, and now The Paris Agent. We both, Donna and I both read The German Wife and this one, and we absolutely loved it. We thought it was brilliant. So before we start talking about your current book, one of the things you had me tearing up at the very beginning because you dedicated it to your mother who had been sick the whole time. And as someone who's balanced that, having a sick parent while you're trying to write, it's impossibly hard. And it was such a sweet dedication. So it's like, I'm glad she's doing better. And
Thank you. Thank you. It was a tricky book to write when we weren't sure if Mum was going to survive or not, because the book is, their contemporary timeline is so much about a woman who's just lost her mum. So doing edits and, you know, being in the story at that time was very challenging, challenging.
Well, it is, because your mind's in two different places. And so you're trying to focus, but you're always thinking in the background about what's going on. So it's
true.
So, and the fact that you pulled off such an incredibly complex book.
Thank you.
So, can you tell us a little bit about it, what it's about?
Well, there's three threads in this one. There's two women who are members of the British Special Operations Executive, which was a spy agency basically during World War II. And then in 1970, we have a father and daughter who are struggling with the loss of the family's matriarch. And their timeline kind of unfolds in Liverpool and Manchester in the UK. And he was an agent with the SOE, and they're kind of searching for some answers about his service, because he's, through trauma and through a head injury, his memory's not the best. So he knows he was involved and he has, you know, quite distinct memories, but there's some gaps. And so he's trying to find someone that he thinks saved his life. And as they search for that agent, the stories of the other two protagonists and my two female agents unfold around it.
And now we know that since that's what it's about, and it's a really, I will say, you threw some really good twists in. It was very gripping trying to figure that. But as a writer, it's probably about other things besides what's on the surface. So I'm going to say, what was the theme? What would you say was the main theme? I know what I thought it was, but I'd like to hear from you.
I started the very seed of the idea way back years ago, when I was thinking about one day writing about these women in the SOE. I was thinking about how someone had made a comment to me about meaning, and how, you know, someone said something like, everything happens for a reason. And another friend said, well, yes, because you find a reason for everything that's happened. You derive meaning from things. It's not inherently, you know, there's no actual meaning necessarily in events in our lives. And for some reason, I started thinking about that, and how some, you know, future generations, particularly, you know, when I look back at things that happened in my ancestors' lives, how it seems like, you know, it was meant to be, but that's because the reality we've always known. And that got me thinking about how we know a version of people that is shaped, every person you know, they're shaped by the events of their past. But you only know them as that person. And so it's all a bit muddy and complex, but that's really where it started, was with this idea of meaning, and how the actions of other people influence our ancestors, and that influences the reality that we grow up with. And so for Charlotte, the daughter in the 1970s timeline, she's known her dad as a man with a brain injury, and as a man who is in some ways very forward focused, not necessarily looking back for most of his life, but that's all she's ever known. And so as they search for the truth about his past, she discovers this whole other side to her father. And that's really, that's a very, very long answer, but that's really where it started for me.
Well, and she learns about her mother too.
Very true. Yeah. And her mother's gone. So she learns a new version of a woman who's gone, but she was always there. It was just a side of her mum she never saw.
And it makes a lot of sense, because I know as kids, we see our parents only one way. And you know, we see them a little bit different as we get older, but we never really know our parents. And I see now our kids, I'm sure my son sees me in one particular way, and, you know, has no idea about all these other things that happened in my life that shaped me. So I thought that it was a lot about that. And then on the other side of it, these were people who were looking for something to do something that had meaning. They wanted to contribute.
So true. Yes.
During that time. And they're driven by a need to do something bigger than themselves. And I thought that was a really interesting meaning too, because they knew what they were risking.
They did, and they each had very different motivations for taking the risks that they took and making the sacrifices that they made. But the war was so big, and it had changed the whole world. And these individuals didn't kind of say, well, what difference can I make? I'm only one person. They went, what difference can I make? I'm one person, you know. So it was real, but for both of them, it was a really different driver. So yes, very much so.
And I really like that. And so I didn't have the author's notes because I had an advanced read. So I'm curious, how did you find out about the special operations executive? Because I had never heard of it before this book.
It is the silliest story, honestly. It was 2010, and I was pregnant with my second child, and we were looking at names, baby names, and my husband suggested the name Violette, which there was a family connection somewhere, and he just really liked the name. And I was Googling, you know, you Google the meaning of names, and if you Google Violette, one of the first things that pops up is Violette Sabo, who was an agent with the SOE. Oh, wow. And that was where I discovered this woman, this incredible young woman who was a young widow, young mum, like very young mum. She was in her early 20s, and she was one of the most courageous. She did these incredible missions in France during the war, driven by a desire to avenge her husband's death. And I just became obsessed with her. So that's where it started. And through kind of that obsession, so that kind of, you know, led me into learning about the SOE. And through that, I learned about Diana Rowden, who was the other woman that I loosely based the character of Chloe on, who was another incredible, a little bit older, quite a different story, but another incredibly courageous, just capable woman. And so that was it. That's really my silly origin story for this book.
No, I like it. And I think we should, for people who are watching and don't know, these are just regular people. And they had a month of training before they were thrown in as spies.
Yeah, so they were just, in the case of Violette, she had some very, very limited military service because she worked with the auxiliary territorial service on the searchlights, you know, the big lights. They looked for the planes, the German planes, and they would kind of guide the British men to shoot the planes down as they were over London. So she'd done that for a little while, but other than that, she was just a regular, you know, 20-year-old when she was recruited. And then it was a couple of months of very intensive, you know, training at these different schools around the UK. So they would go off and have like a boot camp test week. And if they survived that, and I mean, we're talking like quite intensive, long hikes and these incredible obstacle courses and, you know, middle of the night wake ups where the British would come in and throw icy water over them to see what language they shouted in if they were aroused from sleep suddenly. They were loosely tortured to see how they'd respond in an interrogation. And then a few months of learning how to shoot, learning how to use explosives, learning how to use a cover story and how to, you know, how to tail someone. And then they were put on a plane and dropped into France. So, you know, can you imagine 3 months from now having to adopt a whole new identity and go undercover in an occupied territory? They were just remarkable. Yeah.
Yeah. And now, so since you said it's loosely based, Josie is a chronic illness as well.
That's right. Yeah. So
reality, or is that something you added for?
I wanted to write about someone with a chronic illness during the war because things were not, you know, people still had bodies that malfunctioned and, you know, that particularly under extreme stress. And so that idea actually, Diana Rowden didn't have, it's celiac disease that my character has. Diana Rowden had an abdominal surgery though, early in, I think it was 1942. So I kind of, when I was researching her and I discovered she'd been in this convalescent home and was frustrated by how slow her recovery was from this abdominal surgery. And that really got me thinking about what it would be like, you know, but some of these, there was the amputees, there were people with disabilities who were in the SOE, because it, you know, we're all different. And in a sense, like as much as the world has changed and become more accepting of diversity since those days, the SOE was trying to find regular people who just looked like regular people, and regular people don't always have fully functional bodies.
That's true. Well, and I'm thinking about it as someone who has a gluten allergy, you know, trying to live like that during the war.
Particularly when it wasn't, you know, celiac disease wasn't fully understood at the time. So, you know, I think it was a 30% fatality rate for children with celiac disease because, you know, they would be sick and their bodies would be kind of in crisis, and doctors didn't understand it was food related, so they didn't know what to exclude. So you know, so I've got her navigating this world where food is already scarce, and she's kind of intuitively understands how to work with her own body because, you know, we do over time figure out how to best thrives even in the war, even with this limited kind of academic understanding of her condition, who still does amazing things. And so, yeah, so that Diana Rowden didn't have, as far as I know, celiac. They called it celiac sprue at the time. She didn't have that, but there was this mystery abdominal thing. And so that really sparked something in my mind about, let's write someone that's dealing with a body that has this unique need.
That's kind of cool, though. I think it did add a little bit layer to it because you knew she was suffering, and it made her even more human and more delicate. But she was incredibly smart.
She was, and I wanted to write her because when I was researching Diana, she was someone who had this unique perspective on how to get things done, and so I wanted to write someone that she's not physically strong and imposing. She's physically frail at times, but she's still strong in all of these other ways.
Now, I will say, you open on the chapter 1, they're on a train in 1944. And I think I was holding my breath from that moment because and it really adds to the tension for people who are reading it because you just are waiting. There's no good thing that can happen about being on a train with Germans in 1944. And you know it, but you just don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. And that whole scene really happened to Diana and several other women. So the first scene in the book, they're on this train. It's a passenger train. It's quite comfortable. They've got sudden, unexpected access to amazing food, and they've had a shower and they're wearing fresh clothes. And you don't know why, but this really happened as part of the journey that Diana took.
Oh, wow. So I see it now, having not had the notes here, I'm thinking this all came from your head, and I was incredibly impressed. But did you know? I'm still impressed. Don't get me wrong. The story itself is, like I said, super complex. There's 2 timelines, really 3, 2.5, 3. There's 3 points of view, but everyone is connected. It's like a spider web where, you know, even the dead mother plays a very big role. And, you know, if you were to draw lines, it would look like a giant spider web on it. So I was wondering if you could, for the writers in the group and for me, if you could pull back the curtain a little bit and tell us how you managed to pull that off, because it's very impressive. Like, is there
a spider web
wall or like?
I have software, and it looked like a spider web in the software. I use this software called Aeon Timeline, and I plug in the historic events and then plan the story around it. And by the time I'd finished this book, it actually did look like a spider web because there's lines going from here to here to here. And that was just tracking dates and, you know, connections between people. The rest of it lives in my head, but so, you know, it's about how old would Charlotte be on this date? You know, I can go and look quite quickly. And also when I'm writing, I try and use the real historic events, like, for example, that train trip. I don't want to move the date of that. I want to get the details about that as correct as I can. And so I try and plan the story. And sometimes I have to move things slightly for plot reasons, but I try not to. And so that's the foundation. That's the skeleton. And then around that, I build the fictional story. And so if I were to draw on the wall, or I write on the window, actually, with markers on the window, if I were to do that, it would look, you know, but I find it so much easier.
With all the threads. And
like serial killer board or something. Yeah, so I use that same process with all of my books because I've found that I just can't keep track otherwise. I mean, I could, but it'd be so much messier.
Now, are you one of those people that writes everything all at once, or do you do do you do the narrative separately?
So I've done it both ways, actually. I plot very extensively. So before I start, I usually know first sentence, last sentence, and basically all of the key things that are going to happen in the middle. And so I write quite a long outline, and then I move that across into Scrivener and kind of break it up into chunks. But then after that, it's chaos because I will write the first chapter and then I might write the 10th chapter, and then I might go through any really heavy, intense scenes, particularly where I need to do something to a character that I know I'm not going to want to do after I've spent months in their head. So in the past, I've written where I've had to kill someone off and I know I'm not going to, it's going to be awful, and I wake up and I'm just in the right mood, I'll write that scene. So I kind of write all over the place and then almost fill it in, it's like colouring in. Because Scrivener gives me the framework. So I don't write in order. And sometimes I'll do like, if I've got 3 threads like this, I might write 1 thread first. But again, I use that same process. And in this case, I jumbled it up. The last 2 books, actually, German Wife was the same. I kind of wrote a linear story and then jumbled it up a bit more at the end. So I don't know that I'd advise that. Tricky. I don't know if I'd recommend that approach, but there are times when, I get editorial feedback and my editors might say, oh, this, you might add a bit of tension by doing this or doing this. And so it just has worked out that way. 2 books in a row.
Yeah, what works, it works. It's funny because I was actually earlier in the week at a lecture Beatrice Williams gave, which, by the way, they compare this book to Our Woman in Moscow. So
yes.
And she talked about how she has to write them separately because she said, well, I can't know how their voice sounds unless I finish their first story, which was very interesting. And I never heard of someone who did that. Most people I know do what you do. Well, actually not out of order, but they do kind of do it at the same time because things are happening simultaneously. Yeah,
I think as with just about everything with writing, I think it's a case of every individual writer has to do trial and error until they find something that works. So even for plotting or pantsing, the first few books I very much just wrote and kind of wrote for fun and saw where the story went. And then after my 3rd book, though, I realized I needed to know what I was writing towards because I kept writing myself into corners, and I realized that the way that my brain works, I need to know what's coming. And so, but that took it took more than that because I'd written and not been published for years. But even in terms of like, I was a project manager at one point, so I used to have quite a structured approach to my day and, how I got all my tasks done. And as I've been writing over the last few years, it's chaos. It is chaos all the time, but the process is so I've got incredible structure on the planning, and then I might be writing at midnight and I might be writing at a cafe at midday. It's just whenever it's flowing. So I think it is just absolute trial and error for everyone. It's not fair because people say, how do I do something? Like, you just got to try and figure it out.
It works. So can we go for a minute to The German Wife? Because
sure.
Something I didn't think was possible, and that is that you made me feel very sympathetic towards a Nazi's wife. And it's hard. And that's what I was thinking. I was very impressed because it had to have been a very hard walk to stay, like a thin line, because you don't want to be too sympathetic. And she didn't do everything. She wasn't a saint. She was a Nazi's wife. So how hard was that for you? Because I found that to be, you did a very good balancing act. It's one of the things I love about books is that you frequently have shades of gray, because no one's 100% of one thing or the other, even Nazi, which, except for like the worst of them, most of them had some humanity in it. So how hard was that for you to do and keep your head in the trying not to like her too much versus making her too bad?
Yeah, she makes some hideous decisions. They both do in that book. And it was really tricky because she was always going to be the protagonist. And so I knew I was going to ask readers to be in her head for the whole story, for big chunks of the story anyway, because I've got 2 protagonists. But it was a case, and at no point do you ever want to justify any of that ideology, so but it wasn't the case that an entire nation suddenly went, this is how I think and feel about other people. And so I wanted to tell the story of someone who got dragged along behind this awful government, and so for her, she's someone who is, there's not an anti-Semitic bone in her body. Her best friend is Jewish, and they're as close as sisters, and so from the start of the story, I'm trying to paint a picture of someone who, in an ideal world, would just have left or would have, been part of the resistance or the opposition, but she's got this family and she's got kids she's got to try and protect. And so it was really tricky. It was so tricky. And I think my edits in that book were really intense. And part of that was just trying to get that balance right of absolutely not justifying any of the mistakes that family makes.
Yeah.
But trying to stay true to the history, because there were people who were swept up in all of that madness who were not supportive of it, but who were felt, you know, the nature of the way that you know, the right came to power was that it was little slivers of evil over time, and they just built this oppressive country where you could no longer speak up. You couldn't speak up in your own homes because someone might overhear, and then the Gestapo would be at the door at 3 a.m., you know. And so there was such terror. And so trying to write that was, I think it was one of the more difficult books that I've, you know, written, because there's grey all through it, but there's also just this big, massive, pulsing evil that you're trying to, you know, I was hoping people would read that and feel just how impossible a situation it would have been for people who could see it for what it was, but were living in Germany at the time.
That's,
you know,
what I think Donna and I both came up with, because we did feel sympathy for her, because there were some scenes where you knew she was backed in the corner.
Yeah.
You know, like her husband, who's clearly based on Werner von Braun.
Yeah.
And I can imagine a man like that was incredibly tunnel visioned, being married to an aerospace engineer. Like, all he cared about was getting his rocket off. You know, marry a genius and not realize. So to him, he could probably block out everything and focus only on the project. And for her, she saw everything. But as a mother, you know, if you don't make this decision, your child will be hurt. But if you make this decision, you know, she did have to send her child to the Nazi youth, and she knew she was teaching him how to hate. But it was a great scene where she's like, I have to do this because it's the only way he's going to be alive afterwards for me to teach him another way.
Yes. Yes.
And so you did feel like this trap thing, even though she did horrible things. And interestingly, the American woman wasn't a saint either, which I thought was really great, because you balanced it all out. You know, pointing out that we weren't all great either in some certain respects. And she also did what she had to do.
And people are so complicated, you know, and if you want to write a three-dimensional character, they cannot be entirely likable. They have to have aspects of their personality that are ugly, because every one of us does. And so that balancing act is really tricky, but every single new character is, you've got to ask yourself those questions if you want it to feel real and three-dimensional.
Well, it was very brave and very impressive. So we really did love it, and we could see like the tightrope walk that you had to do. So
thank you.
All right, we'll do a couple fun, lighter questions since we're wrapping up. What do you read?
Oh, do you know, I've just moved house and I've lost my book. But I'm reading The Last House on the Street by Diane Chamberlain, which is, it's been on my pile for ages. And then when I was packing, I found it and I started reading it and I couldn't put it down. But now I've had to put it down because it's gone.
It's in a box.
It's in a box, yeah.
All right, and what are you working on now besides or are you completely on vacation because it's promotion time and house moving time?
No, I don't know any writer that can just switch off from writing. When I'm between books, I'm intolerable. I'm so impatient to start the next one. I have like side projects when I'm not working on a project for publication. I've got books, stories that I just write. You know, that's how our brains tend to work. I'm working on another novel which will probably be out next year, and it is. I'm not at the point where I can explain it succinctly.
Is it another World War II era book, or do you?
No, it's not actually. It's. I think you would call it a historical mystery. Ooh. So, it's in the 60s, set around the 60s, and part in the 80s, and then part in 2010. So it jumps around a little bit, but yes, it's a bit of a mystery.
Oh, I like it. That's exciting. It's nice to see you breaking out from World War II. Not that we don't love your World War II books. Yeah. It's always nice when a writer breaks out and tries something different. So
yeah. It's not a light story, but anything is light when you compare it to World War II. So it feels a little bit different writing a different era.
And my last quick question is, if you had one piece of advice to give a writer, what would you give them?
It's a little bit cliched, but for me, it's just, you've got to get the first draft down. I'm a better editor than I am writer, and I think it's taken me a really long time to realize I need the first draft down as quick as I can. It doesn't matter how messy it is. It doesn't matter if there's huge gaps. I just kind of race towards the finish line. And for me, that really has been the making of my process, is realizing that it's okay if I have the first draft done and it's horrible, because I can go back and massage and edit and polish. But again, I really think every writer, it's so unfair, but every single one of us just has to try different things, see what works. You'll have disasters. Disasters are great because you can learn from them, and just see what works for you.
So we're going to get you out right on the 30-minute mark. I'm a good girl.
Nice work. I hope someone's impressed.
The book is The Paris Agent. It's out tomorrow, June 18th.
It was out last week, 11th.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, so it's out June 11th. It's already out. It's already gotten great reviews. I think it's got like a 4.5 or 4.6 rating on.
I don't know because I'm too scared to look.
Well,
I never look.
I will say that it's got very high ratings, and
well, thank you.
Low ratings were things like my arc had a typo.
Oh.
You downgraded the book for that. Why? But no, it's getting fantastic reviews. We loved it. Donna loved it. I loved it. You are now an auto buy for us, so I can't wait.
Thank you.
And we really appreciate you doing this. I know it's 10 a.m. over there for you. And you're in the middle of moving and it's cold and all the other things, but we wish you nothing but big sales. We look forward to seeing this hit some lists. And thank you so much for coming by.
Thank you. No, my pleasure. Have a great evening.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.